Artist statement. How do we as individuals change the landscape? I'm not interested in aggressive, intentional changes, whether that be by the land artists of the 1970s or a global earth-moving corporation. I'm interested in how a man or woman's mere presence affects the way that others perceive a given space. That space may be as small as a box or as large as the Pacific. When a woman walks across Times Square, does that woman ignite thoughts, passions, fears about Times Square that we might not feel if a very different woman took her place? Are the differences subtle or palpable? And how does the landscape then change the viewer? For nearly 10 years, my art has been in dialogue with the work of Anna Mendieta, whose own work interrogated the relationship between nature and the female body. While Mendieta was interested in returning to the earth, leaving her own bodily imprint in the earth, to be absorbed by earth, therein allowing herself to be taken along with it, to be reborn, I am interested in how we affect the landscape merely in being present. The model may be present in the photograph, but the model is not the intended focus. The model activates the landscape, and the activated landscape should be the viewer's focus. The model is merely my paintbrush, chisel, or sculpting hand. The finished work is everything lying outside of the model. I am not taking photographs. I am conducting an experiment to better understand the relationship that several subjects have with nature. Celia Merode, 1987. The final group crit is the worst day of the program, unless you're like one of those pompous pricks who's completely oblivious to how everyone hates you. You have a group crit class of 24 people, and for what feels like weeks, each person presents their work from their entire 4 years, their central oeuvre, explaining what they've done and why they've done it. Everyone in class asks you questions, and you basically gotta defend it like you're in court or something. Nah, it's not like a PhD defense where you might not get the degree if you fuck it up. But fuck, nobody cared about the degree if everyone hated your shit. We did our final crit in the gallery space in the foundation building. It was supposed to feel like putting on one-person shows. But your professor and classmates gawked from 24 desks in front of you. On Celia's day, everyone lurched past the 4 works she'd hung on the wall. It actually looked like 12 works, though, 12 color photographs, blown up to 2 feet by 2 feet each. Not even framed like most people did for a big crit because she didn't want to spend the money. They were set off into groups of 3. So no central core imagery BS this time, and each group hung together in a row. The first group was the Times Square series. It must have been really early that day, just before dawn, because the streets were eerily empty. I doubt many people would recognize it today. It's not like now where there are 3-story high billboards plastered all over the buildings. At the main intersection where Broadway and 7th cross, there were 3 big ads. Sony, Midori, you ever have Midori before? And Coke. None of them were even lit up. On either side of them, you saw the sky's blue light cutting canyons between the buildings. And all of the pics pretty much looked the same. But in the foreground, you saw a different man or woman crossing Broadway in each photograph. A chick in a field hockey uniform. Some bougie lady who probably lived next to my parents on the Upper East Side. A man in white with a bright red tie. Each model showed up again in the next series. a mostly empty subway car, then a famous street in Dumbo where one of the Brooklyn Bridge's towers stood between the buildings, and on the back of the Staten Island ferry leaning against the railing with the World Trade Center tower sticking out to their left. Everyone sat down and listened to Celia give her artist statement. Now, a lot of people shrink into themselves when doing their statements. They wrap up in their arms, squeezing themselves like they're trying to disappear. Celia, though, she controlled the floor, even when I knew she didn't really believe in it. No, this obviously wasn't the thesis I expected from Celia when I met her 4 years earlier. I think younger Celia would have been pissed at this one. Everyone waited for Truax to start. He was an authoritative guy. Not particularly tall, but he had a very pronounced jaw and a bald head with a horseshoe of gray scruff wrapping around his scalp. He basically looked like an ancient Greek marble bust with an olive wreath. And he was never mean, but very, very rarely kind. So it was an even bigger deal when he first talked up Celia's shit. He said, Celia is working in a number of traditions, some of which are quite new. Now, I don't want to name any of those at the moment. First, I want to ask, what do you see? A lot of people never talk in crit. They think that if they're quiet, people won't tear them down when they're up on the chopping block next. But there are always 2 or 3 people who start talking before Truax can even finish his question. A guy in back said, these pictures are really focusing on some of the city's iconic scenes. You have the towers, Times Square, whatever. The people in them become something like an afterthought. Someone else said, that's the point though, right? Like, we're not supposed to think about the people so much as we are the scene around them. We're supposed to get different vibes from each one. Celia had a bit of, a reputation. Now, some guys, like Bruce Gribaldi, could be self-assured jerks, and people just said, it's Bruce being Bruce. Some people actually thought it was endearing. But whenever Celia was uncompromising or just, intelligent, she was a bitch, a cunt, a feminist. Like that was a bad thing. A lot of guys hated her as much as the girls hated Bruce. The early expectations didn't help anything. No matter what she did, she couldn't prove to people she was the genius the professors talked her up to be. So we weren't really sure how Celia's crit would go. Some guys were out for blood. They had been for 4 years. Bruce said, I don't understand. Of course he didn't understand. But when he said it, it meant he thought it was stupid. And he usually thought it was stupid because he didn't get it. He said, you mentioned land art, but you aren't really interacting with the land. Do you really consider this land art? And Celia said, yes. She was very matter-of-fact. It is very subtle, but it is land art. I'm altering the landscape. Bruce pouted and turned to Truax like he wanted to make an inside joke with him. But Truax didn't look at him. Bruce turned back to Celia and said, whatever you think you're doing, I don't see how it's any different than just taking any other photograph. You could take any 3 photographs of Times Square and say that the different people in them change the landscape. I don't see the point. He was deliciously close to getting the point. Then Bruce said, I suggest reading the essays of Robert Smithson. I think those will really help in your little photo project here. Truax held up his palm like he was signaling Bruce to just stop already. He asked somebody else to speak. A girl with a perfectly round black bob said, I looked at each of the people for a long time when you had them up in the studio, and a little bit more today. It's interesting to see them all up together, but you're the model in each of the pictures, right? I felt the class lean forward in their chairs trying to see if it was really her in the pictures. Then Celia said, "That's not really relevant to the concept." Somebody said it was. Another thought, "That guy is way too tall to be Celia." And then somebody finally asked, "Is it you?" She looked at everyone stone-faced. Whether it is or isn't, it's not relevant. I think she liked this game. People argued for 5 minutes over whether it was Celia. Somebody said, "I think it is relevant if it is her. Maybe not to the concept, but I think Cindy Sherman would care if Celia's just ripping her off." I said, "This is totally different than Sherman. You always know it's Sherman in her photographs." Then Celia said, "Let's say it is me. But who's to say that I'd be inspired by Cindy Sherman? Who's to say it wouldn't be an homage to other women who wore costumes for their art, like Eleanor Anton or Claude Cahun? If you're gonna accuse somebody of ripping off another artist, at least go back farther than somebody you just read about in art forum." Then Black Bob said, "Sherman's pictures are different. I've read that she's trying to create emotions personified, so her work is much more focused on the characters she's creating. Celia seems to want us to focus on the relationship between the model and the landscape. We're not necessarily supposed to see ourselves in the pictures." This girl Donna, she said, "Honestly, I like the concept a lot, but I don't think it's coming across in the bigger scenes. Times Square, the World Trade Center, these places are so overpowering that the model's aura, for lack of a better word, is getting lost. You can't see how the model is changing the scene because the setting won't let her. Or him, I guess." A girl in cat-eye glasses said, "But maybe that's the point." She stopped, and everyone's like, "And?" But she didn't continue. So Truax said, "Go on, Sloane." She's like, "Well, okay. So we have these very masculine objects, the World Trade Center, which is obviously very phallic and maybe even homoerotic. And then there's Times Square, which is very overbearing and in your face about what it wants you to do, to buy shit. Both scenes exert their power over the female characters, smothering them, really. Personally, I think the male characters in those scenes do stand out more than the women. I think Celia is making a subtle but, powerful statement about how women are oppressed, not only by men, but by, architecture in general." People turned to Celia to see if she'd confirm this, but she just stared back at them. And Truax, he doesn't like it when the artist fully explains themselves. He usually doesn't even want people to say much after the opening statement. Then Bruce started to say, "Don't get me wrong." And I already rolled my eyes before I could get him wrong. He said, "I respect women probably more than any other guy in here." I smiled at this guy Ben, who I had been sleeping with. We always joked about how much Bruce respected women, and Ben did not look too happy to hear about it again during the crit. Bruce said, "But aren't we beyond feminism at this point? Feminist art was happening more than a decade ago. If this is feminist art, isn't Celia going backwards instead of forwards?" This was enough to make Celia speak. She said, "I didn't intend for the work to be neatly categorized with a feminist from 10 years ago. I suppose if you like to think that nature is a mother, then I suppose you could say that my true subject, the landscape, is a woman. But even then, it's not my intention to focus on an old feminist critique or to be judged positively through that feminist lens. If it is judged positively that way, it's just a happy coincidence." Truax had been holding up his palm for Celia to stop through half of her response. Then Bruce said, "And I don't see how you're in dialogue with Ana Mendieta. Have you seen any of her work?" She got really snarky and said, "I'm a little familiar with it." And he's all, "I'm looking at these photographs and trying to get the connection. I'm not an expert, but I got the gist of Mendieta's work after seeing a show after she died. And she was really using her body. She did those, how's it pronounced, silhouettes? Silhouettes. Then he actually said, "No, I'm pretty sure it's Saluta's." And he said, "It was just her impression in the dirt. She worked with nature and her body. Not my favorite stuff, but it's probably a woman thing." He actually said that, a woman thing. And then he said, "Either way, you're not working with nature. You're not working with your body." I said, "It is her body," and pointed at the photographs. "If it's her in the pictures, then it's her body." Bruce turned to me and said, "Don't be so obtuse." But I have no fucking idea what he meant by that. Then he turned back to Celia and he actually asked, "Have you read that essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" Celia went, "Oh," obviously sarcastic, but it was totally over Bruce's head. "I haven't heard of that one. Please tell me about it." Truax stopped everybody. He said, "I'd like to go back to what Sloane and Donna were saying, because I think they have valid points. The larger scenes, the iconic New York scenes, they do become troublesome. And perhaps that is due to their masculine qualities, like Sloane suggested. But I think that Donna is right in that these larger scenes don't allow the viewer to absorb the subtle differences created by each subject. You got the field hockey player on the ferry. Now, I obviously have a different reaction to her than the man with the tie. But that reaction is based on them, not on what they do or don't do to the landscape. Then I look at the towers in both pictures, and my perception of them doesn't really change. But when I look at the subway car over there, you see the field hockey player creates a much different vibe than the man. Most of the riders are indifferent in both pictures. But you can see that the man there in the black leather jacket, he's leering at the field hockey player. And you can see that the Con Ed guy is sneaking a glance at her. Neither man does this in the other photographs. Then he finished by saying, "So when we get into this cramped subway car, we begin to sense how the woman affects the landscape." Of course, only when it was in a small, cramped subway car.